we come into in today's text, we're coming, of course, we're getting closer and closer to the end of the Pentecost season, and of course the intensity for Jesus is beginning to rise as he encounters the chief priests, the elders, the people of power within the temple. The tensions are rising as we come sort of to this end of this time of season. And today we get the biggest question, right? The biggest question, the biggest challenge to Jesus, and the chief priests and the elders, as Jesus is entering the temple, challenge him and say, by what authority? By what authority do you think you're teaching? Who gives you this authority? And who gives you this authority, right? I mean, that's where he's going with this. And it's an interesting phrase because Matthew uses it a number of times. And it comes from a noun, exousia, is the noun, by what authority, exousia. And it's interesting because it's translated throughout the scriptures in various ways. Matthew, in this instance, it gets translated a lot of times as authority, but throughout scriptures it's sometimes translated as freedom. By what freedom do you do this? By what ability do you do this? By what power do you do this? It can be translated a lot of different ways. And I want you to think about those different ways of looking at that word, authority. By what power, by what ability, by what freedom do you do these things? Right? Because in chapter 7, right, we're told Jesus is teaching, and Matthew says, he taught as one having authority. Or he taught as one having freedom. He taught as one having ability, power. You get the idea? And then in chapter 8 he goes on and he says, the centurion asked Jesus, just give me the word. Your word, by your authority you will heal my child, right? By your freedom, by your ability, by your power, I know my child will be healed. And then Matthew goes on, chapter 9, the Son of Man has authority to forgive sins, has the freedom to do so. How many of you think of yourselves as having the freedom to actually forgive? Right? Or the ability, right? Or the power. And then in chapter 10 he says, and he had the authority to cast out unclean spirits. The authority to cast out unclean spirits. And then today's text, of course, we get, by what authority are you doing this? By what kind of freedom? Who gives you this kind of freedom to speak like this? Right? And then finally in chapter 28, Matthew uses it one last time, right? And Jesus will say, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. It's a fascinating sort of word. Right? But there's so many ways that we could hear that differently, right? I mean, so when you feel this tension between the elders and the priests and Jesus, and they come to this question of authority, you know, what do you think's really just going on there? Well, what do you think's really rubbing these folks?
They were testing his authority.
Well, they're testing his authority. Well, they're doubting his authority in many ways. But I mean, why the rub?
They don't like to be bossed.
They don't like to be. They think maybe Jesus was a little bossy in their circumstances.
What makes him think he understands it better than us?
Ah, what makes you think you understand God any better than we do? Yeah? Okay. I guess that's why we have denominations, right? What makes you think you understand God any better than we do? Right? But everybody's thinking that, right? Everybody's thinking that. Oh, I understand God better than they do. Right? Now we're back to Charlie's joke, right? The guy on the stranded island, right? Why are there two churches there? Well, that's the one I used to go to. This is the one I go to now. Right? Yeah.
Or the expressions about Lutherans. Not all Lutherans go to heaven, but no one else
does. So by what authority? By what authority? So they're rubbed up. They're rubbing up against, you know, how can you interpret God this way? When maybe we've got the right interpretation. How many times do you feel like you just got the right interpretation in everything you do in your life? Right? I mean, right? So there's a bit of a rub there. By what authority? What makes Jesus different from them? I suppose that really is the question. How can you be any different than us? You know, it's not like we're preaching bad news, right? But authority can come in so many ways, right? It can come in so many ways. I mean, how do you deal with people who are authoritarians in your life? Well, with a little bit of resistance, right? And what's that resistance coming from?
Not being told my freedom. I want my freedom.
I want my freedom. I don't want to be told what to do, right? And that goes back to that whole word of there's a certain level of freedom in authority, right? A certain level of ability, right? And how do you compare somebody who's been authoritarian as to somebody who comes to you with an inner freedom, an inner power, an ability to sense what's right? How do you react to people like that?
I'm probably more open, to receive them.
More open, right? You get the whole sense of his power here. This is what Jesus is talking about in terms of the prostitutes and the tax collectors, and you know, one can come down with some sort of a purity code where you simply say you're wrong, we're right, you've got to change, right? Or the others come into a sense of ability, of power, a sense of empowerment, and giving the people the power to turn their lives around, as opposed to telling them, turn your life around. You feel a difference? You feel a bit of a difference there? Yeah. So then it comes down to the question of, I suppose for Jesus, question to each of us is, how might God be a source of freedom? How might God be a source of inner power, of some new ability, some new power in your own lives?
Knowing that we're forgiven and that we have a new start.
So the sense of having a new start, the freedom to have a new start, and not being burdened by the past. How else might you discover a newfound authority or freedom or inner power from God in your lives?
When I think of that, I think of let go and let God.
Letting go and letting God. Letting go of whatever seems to bind or restrict us, and let's find some new freedom in life.
We know His blessings that we appreciate it, we thankful for.
So a new freedom to understand that life can be a blessing and to give thanks for those blessings. Yeah. Well, it's in this context, right? It's in this context that that Jesus tells this parable about the yes/no children, right? The yes/no children. One who says, yes, I'll go to the vineyard, and of course doesn't. The one who says no, but then ends up going, right? So I want us to take a moment to imagine what brings us that kind of freedom to actually tend to a vineyard. What does it take to tend to a vineyard, do you think?
Hard work.
It takes some hard work. What kind of hard work? What do you imagine is involved in tending to a vineyard?
Pruning.
There's pruning. There's probably maybe watering, maybe weeding, fertilizing, harvesting. Now think of your own life as a vineyard. What is it that we need to tend to? And how many times do we say yes to it? And how many times do we say no to it?
We're very busy.
I mean, seriously, if our life is a vineyard,
We need a little fertilizer.
yeah,
Some pruning.
and we might need a little pruning. We might need a little weeding.
Yeah, I'm really weedy. You also have to trust the time of waiting. The time of waiting.
Oh, there's also the time of waiting. There's also trusting the time of waiting until
Plan
the fruit comes to fruition, you know, I mean, from the flower to the fruit.
When to pick is about waiting,
Yeah.
you know, judging the quality of the grape and when to pick.
And isn't it interesting, I mean, isn't it interesting that the two sons come at this with a sense of ambivalence? Both of them really come with some sense of ambivalence to tending to the vineyard, right? Right? I mean, and ambivalence means that you don't really care, one way or another. What happens to us when we just don't care one way or the other? Nothing gets done. Nothing changes, right? Nothing really changes in our life, right? I mean, and we do that to ourselves, right? Well, sometimes we say yes, but nah, I'm not going to take care of that. Or sometimes we say no, and then we say, oh, well, I really do have to take care of this in my life, right? We go through those sort of things, right? So, what do you know in your own life about saying yes to something but then never following through?
If it was a commitment, I feel guilt.
And then guilt comes in if it was a commitment. But in terms of our own personal growth, how many times do we say, yes, I got to take care of this, and then we just don't? We make up, yeah.
We're hoping it'll go away.
Or we just hope it goes away. We just hope it goes away. Yeah. I'm just not going to pay attention to that, and it'll go away, right? Yeah. We do that. We go into life in some sort of ambivalence sometimes, right? And just as we are a vineyard, so is the church, right, in many ways? And I think this is where Jesus is going with this whole sense of authority, with this whole sense of freedom. We have the freedom to tend to it. And we can say yes to it and follow through, or we can say no to it and follow through. Right? I mean, we have these choices, right? In the way in which we tend our own vineyards, our own lives, and our own community. Right? And yet, how many times does ambivalence creep into our behaviors? Where does that come from? Where does that just not caring come from? Life can be burdensome. And so you just say, I'm giving up on it.
Sometimes we don't do it because we don't see the benefit. We can't define clearly the defined benefit.
So if I'm not getting some sort of reward or some benefit, right? Yeah. And then maybe you don't want to go after it. You can't see the clear reward. There's this great TED talk on dogs. I forget the guy's name, Ian something or another. It was a great TED talk. And he's talking about dogs need ESL, English as a second language. He says, right? He says, I mean, how many dogs really are born knowing English? Seriously. Seriously. And the way you teach the language, the way you teach English to a dog is through some sense of reward. And that's how they end up learning, right? And then they start learning words, and they start learning meanings, and so on and so forth. But it's ESL. It's English as a second language, and it takes place through some sense of reward. So sometimes in our lives, we feel ambivalent if we're not getting the treat. If we're not getting the treat, right? Good boy, good girl, sit. Hurry up, do your business. Right? So sometimes we get ambivalent when we're not getting our treats. Or just not, the language just isn't getting through. The language isn't getting through, right? And so it happens. You know, it happens to us. It can happen to us on Sunday mornings, right? I'd rather lie in bed and read the newspaper instead of getting up and being community, you know. Or, you know, I mean, it just happens in so many ways. Yeah. And how do you think in Jesus' day the temple became a stagnant place? And that's why people look at Jesus with new freedom, new power, new ability. How does a temple become stagnant? Lose its authority? and regulations as opposed to grace and love. I mean, isn't that the temptation, right, in all of our lives, in our own lives and in our church community, that we can become stagnant and lose authority?
When we lose the meaning to the rules, where it becomes rote.
Sometimes our directions in life, our rules in life become rote and then become meaningless. So what then goes back to, that brings us back to really, what is it that was really drawing people to Jesus? What was the authority that they were really, the freedom, the power, the ability that they were being drawn to over and above the temple?
They had control themselves. They could make their decision.
Okay?
Free will.
They had some free will, they had some acceptance,
Mercy.
they found some mercy, they found some love, they found some forgiveness,
Acceptance.
they found some acceptance,
Found the truth.
they found some truth. Yeah. You see? And so then what then becomes the thing that makes us vibrant? When we're accepting, when we're truthful, when we're healing, when we're loving, when we're grace-filled, when we're forgiving. You see how that works? You see how that all works in the vineyard and how the vineyard becomes richer and richer because of it, right? And this is really what Jesus is saying. He's saying, I'm inviting people into this vineyard of life. Into this place of nurture, this place where they will grow from the true vine, as Jesus says, right? They will grow and they will bear fruits, right? And so he's looking for us to have a change of heart and to tend to the vineyards of our lives. Right? And he's asking us to do so with a little bit of grace, a little bit of mercy, a little bit of forgiveness, right? And maybe even a little bit of yes. And maybe a little bit of yes, even though we want to say no. He wants us to care for one another. Yeah. And does that not make the vineyard flourish, right? It's about getting a whole new point of view, a whole new freedom, a whole new ability, a whole new power. And that's what makes a church vibrant with authority.